Hello and good evening. My name is Sam Brandes. I'm the Kevin B. Harrington Student Ambassador. On behalf of the faculty, staff, and students at the New Hampshire Institute of Politics, I'd like to welcome you for joining us to this event. I also want to welcome the group from White Mountain School for joining us all the way from Bethlehem, New Hampshire. Thank you. The Institute's mission is to educate, engage, and empower citizens of all ages to actively participate in the civic and political life of their communities and strengthen democracy. The Institute is nonpartisan and doesn't support any candidates or issues. Before we begin this evening's program, I would just like to remind you to turn off any cell phones and other devices that can make noise. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Heather Silber Mohamed, who is an assistant professor of political science at Clark University. Her research interests include Latino politics, immigrant socialization and participation, immigration policy, and identity politics in the United States, with a focus on influence of race, class, and gender. Dr. Silber Mohamed has also worked for 6 years on Capitol Hill in both the Senate and the House of Representatives. Dr. Silber Mohamed will be joining us for a discussion entitled Immigration and Latino Identity Politics from 2006 to 2016. Following Dr. Silber Mohamed's remarks, we will have a brief question and answer period. Please wait until an ambassador with a microphone comes to you before you ask your question. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Silber Mohamed to the stage.
Thank you so much to Sam for that introduction, to Professor Lucas for inviting me. I was up here last January for the elections conference that St. Anselm's held, and I'm really delighted to be back. Especially talking about this very, very timely question of immigration politics and Latino identity. My focus for much of this talk will be on 2006 and things that happened in 2006, where we saw a historic wave of protests related to immigration across the United States. But I'm going to spend some of our time, both at the beginning and the end, thinking about lessons for 2016. So obviously, immigration has been a very big and hotly contested issue in this election. I'm going to think about some of the implications of what happened in 2006 for the upcoming election. So, as I said, I'll begin by starting thinking generally about the immigration policy debate, both back in 2006 and 2016, and then I'll spend some time thinking about the protests that took place in 2006 and some of the effects that those protests had on Latino attitudes. And then I'll end by extending that to think about implications for 2016. So before I do that, I just wanted to spend a few minutes thinking about why Latinos, why we're gonna spend some of our time this evening thinking about the Latino population and the immigration debate, how that connects to the Latino population. We have seen significant growth in the United States of the Latino population over time, from 6% in 1980 to 9% in 1990, 12% in 2000, up to 16% in 2010. And even in states like New Hampshire, where there's a relatively small Latino population, we've seen very, very significant growth with that population increasing by 75% between 2000 and 2010. We have also seen a rapid vote increase in the vote share of the Latino population and of minority populations in general. So you can see here the green bar represents Latinos. So going from 1992 to 2012, Latinos represented just under 4% of the vote share in 92 and up to 10% in 2012. The 2016 electorate is on track to be the most diverse in US history. So nearly 1 in 3 eligible voters on election day this year are expected to be Hispanic, Black, or Asian American. And this is an increase from 2012, and much of this change is due to strong growth among the Latino population. So Hispanic eligible voters have increased by 17% just since 2012 alone. And much of this growth, the Latino population is very, very young, and much of this growth is by young people in the Latino population going over age 18, so now being eligible voters. Latinos and Asian Americans have typically lagged behind whites and African Americans in terms of voter turnout. Within the Latino population in particular, this group is often referred to as the sleeping giant. So this huge population that is underrepresented at the polls on election day. And there's sort of every 4 years, there's this question of, is the sleeping giant going to be waking up? Is something going to happen that will wake up the sleeping giant, that will increase turnout at the polls? And we can think about whether or not the immigration issue might be the trigger. Another reason why the Latino population is so important and gets so much attention in presidential election cycles is because a number of swing states have very large vote shares that are Latino. So not so much here in New Hampshire, but in Florida, Nevada, Colorado, Latinos make up more than 20% of the population of those states. So a very substantial, significant vote share. So thinking about immigration and the debate over immigration reform, one really big question that's happening in this election cycle is what the effects of this very, very polarizing debate over immigration policy will have, both within and beyond the Latino electorate. So when we think about the candidacy of Donald Trump, he has, since his announcement speech, he has invoked the question of immigration policy in very clear, stark, polarizing terms, much more so than we've seen in the past. And we'll talk about how his language and his approach compares to previous Republican candidates. So when we think about the immigration debate, I wanted to start by giving a little bit of background. So before 1965, immigrants from Latin America weren't really governed by the same rules and regulations that other immigrants in the United States were governed by. So the US had a range of restrictions, but they mostly applied to European immigrants and Asian immigrants. And while there were some administrative limitations on newcomers coming into the United States from Latin America, for the most part, people could come in somewhat freely. That really changed with the 1965 immigration reforms that completely overhauled the United States approach to immigration. And now in the United States, people who come here as immigrants come primarily in one of two ways. So one would be high-skilled visas for people who are engineers, doctors working in the technology sector. They can get special visas for high skills. Another is by someone who has a family member living in the United States. And so we see a lot of people coming from Latin America, particularly through this family member provision. There are not great opportunities for people who have relatively low skills to come to the United States. Even for people who have family members here, the process can be confusing, time-consuming, very expensive. There's very, very long backlogs and delays, sometimes 10 or in some cases even 20 years, depending on where you're from the time that you file your application. So I think it's important to understand this as we think about the undocumented population in the United States, right? So what are the roots of this undocumented population in the United States? As I said, coming to the US through the legal system can be a long process, very expensive, very complicated. We can think about the economic push and pull, so lack of jobs in people's home countries, and also employers in the United States who are willing to employ undocumented immigrants, knowingly or unknowingly. And what we've seen increasingly in recent years is less of an economic pull, especially from immigrants coming from Mexico, but security is also becoming a growing force. So particularly for people coming to the United States from Central America, we've seen deteriorating security conditions in their home country, and many people coming here because they are saying that their home country is unsafe. So this sort of leads us where we are now with roughly an estimated 10 to 12 million people living in the United States without legal status. And we have this ongoing political debate that has been a political debate since in the early 2000s of what to do with this population, what the most appropriate policy solution is. The last time that we had major comprehensive immigration reform in the United States was in 1986. This was authored by signed into law by President Ronald Reagan, and that piece of legislation included some path to citizenship for the undocumented population. So at that point in time, the undocumented population was much, much smaller. It was just under 3 million people, so about a third of what we see today. But among other things, this proposal included a waiting period, a fine, some steps that people who didn't have legal status had to go through, and they could eventually become US citizens. And I would say the most polarizing part of the immigration debate today is whether or not we should have some eventual path to citizenship similar to what was in the 1986 bill. So in 2006, which I said I'll focus on to a large extent in this talk, we saw a bipartisan effort happening in the Senate that was an effort towards comprehensive immigration reform that included a path to citizenship and other provisions, and we saw a very, very partisan bill being passed in the House of Representatives. That was one of the last big pushes for comprehensive immigration reform at the national level. We saw between that and the 2012 election, we saw continued unsuccessful efforts for comprehensive immigration reform. In 2012, Romney, as a candidate, sort of stepped a little bit further to the right on immigration reform. So while George W. Bush had been a strong advocate of comprehensive bipartisan reform, Romney advanced a new policy of self-deportation. And the logic behind this policy was basically to pass lots of different smaller pieces of legislation to make immigrants so unhappy that they would decide, undocumented immigrants so unhappy and uncomfortable that they would decide to move back. They would decide to leave the United States because life had become so difficult for them here. Romney was thought to be really sort of punished at the polls by the Latino electorate for this approach. So whereas George W. Bush won in his second election 40% of the Latino vote, Romney earned only about 27%. So that was already a shift away from the bipartisan approach that we had seen by previous Republicans. Now in 2016, we have seen Trump move even further, right? So Trump is really, really known for this idea of wanting to build the wall. If you watch any Trump rallies, you hear supporters chant, "Build the wall, build the wall, build the wall." It's one of the most common chants that you hear at Donald Trump rallies. He has talked a lot about having a deportation force. So going a step beyond what Romney was proposing in 2012, right? Romney said, we just want to make people's lives so difficult that on their own they decide to leave. Trump is saying, we want to actually find immigrants who are here without legal status and make them leave the country. So we can again think about this significant shift and what some of the implications are for Latino mobilization and participation. So I wanted to now shift to thinking about Latinos and the immigration debate. Much of what I will talk about now I discuss in a forthcoming book that I have coming out that focuses primarily on the 2006 events. And within that I talk a lot about what I call the immigration paradox. So we, the popular press, most people seem to think that immigration is the most important policy issue for Latinos. Interestingly, public opinion polls over time show that this actually isn't really true. So when members of the Latino population are asked, what are the issues that are most important to you? Like people in the general population, the most common answers tend to be jobs, education, the economy, healthcare, right? So immigration tends to come in after those issues. But at the same time, we see the immigration issue really mobilizing the Latino population in a way that other issues don't. And we'll see this really specifically when we think about the 2006 protests. So we saw in 2006 mass waves of protests across the United States, 3.5 to 5 million people coming out into the streets to protest immigration reform. We have not seen, obviously, any similar mass Latino protest related to education or healthcare or anything like that, right? So immigration has sort of this interesting role for driving policy within the Latino population. And so one thing that I think about when I think about this question is, will the immigration debate mobilize all Latinos? So we see within the Latino population very, very significant diversity and very significant differences in experience, differences with respect to US immigration policy. So you can see up here the Latino population by national origin. By far, the majority of Latinos in the United States are of Mexican origin, about 2/3, although the diversity within the Latino population is growing. But sort of legally, we see different treatments, right? So Puerto Rico is a commonwealth of the United States. All Puerto Ricans are born US citizens. So immigration is less of a policy priority in general for that group. Cubans are also treated differently by US immigration law. So any Cuban who is trying to flee to the United States, if they are caught at sea, they're returned to Cuba. But if they make it to the United States, they have an eventual path to citizenship in the United States. So Cubans also are treated differently under US immigration law. So we can think about Puerto Ricans and Cubans as caring much less about immigration policy than members of other Latino groups. Even within the Mexican population, one thing that we've seen over time is with very, very established group members, people who have been here for generations, when immigration policy comes to the center stage, we actually see third, fourth generation immigrants, so people whose grandparents have been here for a very long time, distancing themselves from newer group members, right? So we can imagine a lot of diversity within the Latino population when it comes to immigration. On the other hand, we can think about reasons, especially when we think about the contemporary debate, that many Latinos would respond, even those who are not personally influenced by immigration policy, right? So when we think about some of the negative language that has been used toward the Latino population, when we think about not just policies towards people who are undocumented, but generalizations about Mexicans being rapists and criminals, or language about anchor babies or things along those lines, we see people within the Latino community taking some of this language and these claims very personally, right? So we're gonna think back a little bit more to 2006, as I said, and in 2005, 2006, George W. Bush came to office with a significant share of the Latino vote, really trying to push comprehensive immigration reform. He tried since he was first elected. It got a little bit sidetracked by 9/11, and then he tried very, very hard in his second term to work with Congress to enact some sort of bipartisan proposal, right? And then, as I said, what we saw in the House of Representatives was for the first time this very, very partisan bill that was introduced in December by Congressman Sensenbrenner, the Republican chair of the Judiciary Committee. As you can see, the legislation sought to increase penalties for illegal immigration, expand the border fence, classify unauthorized immigrants and anyone helping them to enter or stay in the United States as felons. So this last provision in particular is what really sparked the crowds who were protesting the bill, because it wasn't just targeting people who were here without legal status, it was targeting anyone who was helping them to stay in the United States. So criminalizing anybody helping undocumented immigrants to stay in the United States. And in surveys of Latinos in the United States, more than 50% of Latinos report knowing or being familiar with someone who doesn't have legal status. So we can imagine proposals like this influencing people, even those who are in the United States legally and have nothing of their own on their own to worry about. So this particular proposal is what really drew the ire of many in the Latino community and led to the protests that we've discussed. And then, as I said, we also saw in the Senate, led by Senator McCain and Senator Kennedy, the companion legislation, which was not really such a companion because it was a bipartisan approach. And these differences, I'll say, have really characterized the debate within the congressional debate over immigration policy for a long time in the United States. To a large extent, it's been intra-party divisions within the Republican Party. So we see more moderate Republicans in the Senate pushing for bipartisan reform, and more conservative Republicans in the House refusing to act on anything that would include a possible path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants. So what I do in my own research, I look at a major national survey that was conducted within the Latino population and happened to coincide with the massive wave of protests taking place across the United States. So this survey was in the field, the Latino National Survey. It surveyed almost 9,000 Latinos in the United States, and it was in the field from November 2005 to August 2006, and the protests happened just about in the middle of that. So I divide the data, I treat it as a quasi-experiment or a natural experiment, and what I do is I divide the data and I compare the people who were interviewed before the protests with the people who were interviewed after the protests to see what sort of differences we can find in attitudes and opinions, right? So you can see here, there's 3,544 people before interviewed before April 1st, which was really when the mass wave of protests started in the United States, and 4,690 interviewed after April 1st. So very, very large number of people where we can draw some really interesting comparisons. So the first thing that I look at is this question of will the immigration debate influence all Latinos equally? So there was really this sense that we would see an increasing unity within the Latino population about immigration policy. So the first thing that I do is look at whether or not attitudes within the Latino population change after the protests. So do people's attitudes, are people within the Latino community more supportive of liberal immigration policies, more supportive of a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants after the protests? So we can imagine that yes, they would be, right? And it's true that yes, across the board, Latinos are generally more supportive of a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants after the protests. But what we see is that within that, very significant differences exist by national origin group. So we see the lines here, the lighter colored one is people interviewed before the protests, the darker one is people interviewed after the protests. So we see that across all groups, individuals are more likely to support a path to legalization for undocumented immigrants after the protests, but we see really, really significant variation within that, right? So for instance, Puerto Ricans, who I said are all US citizens, even after the protests, only 27% of Puerto Ricans support a path to citizenship. We can compare that to Salvadorans, who tend to have the most liberal views. We see 69% of respondents from El Salvador supporting a path to citizenship after the protests. So we can think about these protests and sort of polarizing political events more generally as influencing Latino attitudes substantially, but we still see significant variation within that population. So that was my first question. Another question that I look at is whether or not the protests change how Latinos will think about themselves in the United States. So when we think about how Latinos identify, how they think about themselves in the United States, we're thinking here about social identities, right? How people think about themselves in the social world. We can think about three major social identities, social political identities that Latinos take on. So one is in terms of national origin, so Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, etc. Traditionally in the United States, immigrants have identified, particularly immigrants from Latin America, have identified more in terms of national origin than anything else. The second way that we can think about is in terms of some sort of united identity. So Latino, Hispanic, some sort of umbrella term that includes all Latinos in the United States. And finally, the third way that we think about Latinos identifying is as American, right? So thinking about themselves as becoming American or being American in the United States. And while this might seem like sort of a silly or theoretical question, we actually see really, really significant differences. So Latinos who very strongly identify as American are much more likely to vote, they're much more likely to contact their representatives, they are much more likely to identify with a political party, and likewise that changes the way that other Americans perceive members of minority groups, right? So other Americans tend to be more open, more welcoming to people who are seen as trying to incorporate into the United States. So I'm wondering whether after these protests, if Latino attitudes or identities will change. And sort of the common storyline that we see when we think about these events is that after the protests, the conventional wisdom is that after the protests, Latinos will start to feel more pan-ethnic or more Latino. We'll start to see more unity within the Latino population, right? And this storyline is really, really consistent with earlier eras of Latino activism, where we see a real emphasis on cultural difference. So whether it's from the 1960s, where we saw the movements for Chicano power, Puerto Rican nationalism. In 1994, there was a wave of immigration protests in California, where people were carrying the Mexican flag very prominently. In the mid-1990s, we saw the first Latino protests in Washington, D.C., where we really saw this emphasis on Latino unity, Latinos coming together. And there's really this sense that under circumstances of political marginalization, group members will all come together and unify. So this was sort of the conventional wisdom in the literature at the time. But I think you all, most of you are a little bit young probably to remember the 2006 protests. But that didn't really, to me, jive with what we were seeing in 2006. So the protests that took place in 2006, we saw this real emphasis on being American, feeling American, being included in the US system, being part of what it means to be America, right? So I was thinking, in contrast to the conventional wisdom that Latinos would feel more Latino, that we would be more likely to see actually an embrace of an American identity. So again, what I did was compare the people interviewed before and the people interviewed after, and I found that there's actually no difference in pan-ethnic feelings. So before and after the protests, Latinos were equally likely to identify in pan-ethnic terms, but we do see a pretty substantial difference in the percentage of Latinos who are likely to identify as very strongly American, right? So what we see is this moment of polarization, of mass protest, and instead of people saying we feel more different, we feel more like a minority group or a united minority group, we see actually an increased claim to belonging and an increased claim to an American identity. And what we see is a significant variation within that, right? So thinking about some of the differences that I discussed earlier, we see larger effects. So 6% of Spanish speakers saying they're more likely to strongly identify as American, but no effect among English speakers. So again, we can think about the immigration debate as resonating for some groups of the Latino population and not others. Looking by national origin, we see no difference among Cubans. We see a significant difference among respondents of Dominican origin and ancestry. We see, again, a substantial difference among Mexican Americans and no difference among Puerto Ricans, right? So we can really see not only the shift that the protests in this political debate have had, but also the variation within that. So thinking about some of the takeaways and the lessons and implications for 2016. The big one, I would say, and the first overall one, is that the immigration debate and protests can change attitudes within the Latino population, but variation really does still persist. And those subgroups within the Latino population who are most likely to be mobilized by the immigration issue are Spanish speakers, individuals who are less incorporated into the United States, and then within national origin groups, people of Dominican and Mexican origin or ancestry. So, and again, thinking back to 2016, you can see here some of Trump's Latino outreach, tackables and Cinco de Mayo. So I think really the question about Trump's campaign is whether or not this campaign will minimize some of this variation that we see within the Latino population, whether or not it will motivate Latinos to vote. And so what I'll say about the first question, I think is a really important one, right? Because we can think about immigration, as I said, not only about sort of a clear, concrete policy issue, but we can also think about the expansive rhetoric and language being used by the Trump campaign that many Latinos have found to be offensive, right? And so what we have seen sort of up until now, a lot of the polling about immigration policy, when when polling within the Latino population has asked in previous elections, how important was immigration policy to your vote? How important was something that Obama did on immigration to your vote? How important was Romney's self-deportation policy approach to your vote? We see sort of a ceiling of about 60%. So we see about somewhere between 58 and 60% saying that immigration issues were very important, were very, very influential to their vote. What we have seen with Trump is somewhat higher than that. So a November 2015 poll said that 80% of Latinos viewed Trump as either somewhat or very unfavorable. That was conducted by Latino Decisions. Another poll conducted by Gallup in the beginning of this year found that 77% of Latinos viewed Trump unfavorably. We've also seen a lot of activity at the elite level by Latino performers and politicians. So for instance, Pitbull, the Cuban-American rapper, Ricky Martin, a Puerto Rican singer, they've really led anti-Trump efforts. We've seen a number of performers of various Latino backgrounds come together, organized by Emilio Estefan, to sing a song, "We Are All Mexican," so really trying to emphasize this Latino unity in the wake of some of the comments that Trump has made. So I think the answer to part one is that yes, it does look like Trump is at least minimizing variation within the Latino population. That does not mean that it disappears, but it does mean that it seems to be decreasing. The second question of whether or not he will motivate Latinos to vote, I think is a really tricky one. Again, as I said at the start of this talk, every election people are saying, is the sleeping giant going to wake up? Is this going to mobilize the sleeping giant? We have seen by many anecdotal accounts, many people in the Latino community saying they have been eligible for citizenship for a long time. They're now applying to become US citizens so that they can vote against Trump. And we've seen some evidence that applications for citizenship seem to be picking up. We've seen very large efforts by Univision, the Spanish language network, and other organizations. We've also seen efforts by right-leaning organizations to register Latino voters and to reach out to Latino voters who are eligible for citizenship who have not applied for citizenship. I would say that those efforts actually, to some extent, have not been invoking Trump as clearly as what we have seen on the Clinton side. So I think the answer to the first question, as I said, seems to be yes. The answer to the second question is, anecdotal evidence suggests this, but we don't really have a clear answer to that yet. I can just, to close, I'll show a little bit of what we've seen more recently in Latino polling. So this is a tracking poll of Latino voters that was just released last week, comparing Latino voters in August 2016 versus voters interviewed at the exact same point in the election cycle in 2012. And we see a somewhat significant increase in Latino support for Clinton, somewhat of a decrease in Latino support for Trump. You can't see this that closely, but these are questions basically asking about whether Trump's campaign has made the public more divided on immigration, has increased racial animus, and again, we see the figures approaching 80%, so compared to that roughly 60% ceiling that we have seen in the past. And then finally, we do see some evidence that Latino voters, compared to where they were 4 years ago, are saying that they're more enthusiastic to vote in this election than they were in 2012. So I think that, yes, there does seem to be more unity. There does seem to be, by some indications, increased Latino enthusiasm for the election and increased mobilization, but we have not seen that across the board, and I think the verdict is still out on what sort of turnout we'll see at the polls in November. So, thank you. Happy to take your questions.
Because it's being taped, please wait for the microphone.
Yes, very interesting. You mentioned 3 states at the beginning of your talk, these swing states with large Latino population, Florida, Colorado, and Nevada. Maybe Arizona's in the mix, but President Obama carried all three of those states, both in 08 and 12, and yet, looking at the precipitous drop-off of the Latino support for the Republican candidate from 2012, and the increase in Latino, non-Cuban Latino population in those three states, and yet the current polls are showing pretty much a dead heat. Many of the polls in those three states, it seems to be contradictory. I wonder what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that I didn't get into in my talk is that while we see immigration really motivating and mobilizing Latino voters in one direction, we also see it emerging as a wedge issue to pushing white voters in the other direction. So we definitely have seen evidence over time, and we can think about it in terms of this election specifically, of white voters being pushed to the Republican Party because of the immigration issue. So particularly the sort of the classic Trump voter, the middle class white voters who might be sort of in between parties but are gravitating towards Republicans on the immigration issue. So we see immigration as pushing voters in opposite directions.
When you were doing your survey, did you break it down by parts of the United States? Was there a difference, for example, between the Southwest, which I would assume would be mostly Central American and Mexican, and like the New York area, which is a little bit more diverse?
So I will say, first of all, I did not conduct the survey myself. I don't want to take credit for other scholars' work. So this was a major national survey conducted by a number of scholars to interview 9,000 people is a huge, huge undertaking. There is geographic variation within the survey, and when I analyze the data, I basically control for differences between the states. So I do some statistical techniques to hold the states constant so that we're comparing people from similar states. But because there's traditionally in the United States, immigrants from different backgrounds have settled in different places. So you tend to have Mexicans in the Southwest, Cubans in Florida and New Jersey, Puerto Ricans in New England. There hasn't been, until more recently, a tremendous amount of overlap between these groups. So in my analysis, I focus more on national origin, which is sort of consistent with the geographical differences, just to really try to get as clear an analysis as I can. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Hi. So I was just wondering thank you for the talk. I was wondering, I had two questions actually. One, is there a gender gap among Latinos? And then secondly, I was also wondering about 2016. I haven't heard much about it recently, but I know there was issues, economic issues in Puerto Rico, and I was wondering if you thought that might mobilize Puerto Rican voters in 2016.
Yeah, so those are both excellent questions. I actually also look in my book at gender differences within the Latino population, though I didn't discuss it in this talk. And what we see is very slight differences. So consistent in general in the Latino, in the overall general population, women tend to have more liberal policy perspectives and attitudes than men. Within the Latino population, we see women having very slightly more liberal attitudes towards immigration policy than Latino men. We do see another question, not included in this survey, but another piece of evidence that I think about in terms of variation within the Latino population is different surveys asking Latinos whether or not they participated in the protests or they know someone who participated in the 2006 protests. And we see many more women saying that they participated in the protests or knew someone who participated in the protests than men. So again, we see it somewhat of a slight difference, but it is there. In terms of Puerto Rican politics, so yes, another thing that I didn't say is that Puerto Ricans in general in the United States tend to be much less concerned with immigration issues and much more concerned with issues related to the status of Puerto Rico. So in the past, the question has been, Puerto Rico has this unique Commonwealth status. Should Puerto Rico maintain its status as a Commonwealth? Should they become independent from the United States? should they become a state of the United States. So that is really what has motivated a lot of Puerto Rican voters, even those living in the United States for a very long time. And I would imagine, yes, I would definitely imagine that that's what will continue to shape a lot of Puerto Rican organizing in the United States and not the immigration issue. Although we do see, as I said, growing numbers of Puerto Ricans and Cubans paying attention to immigration, largely because of the rhetoric that we're seeing, and also the more expansive policies.
I like that term, sleeping giant. So it's really got me to think, are there other sleeping giant minority groups besides the Latino for this up and coming election, do you think?
So the other big one has really been Asian Americans. So when we think about political participation over time, we see socioeconomic status is really thought to be the largest driver of political participation, particularly among the white population. We saw in 2012 the African American population voting for the first time at higher rates than the white population, and even higher rates than socioeconomic status would predict. And then we see Latinos and Asian Americans lagging behind significantly, not only in terms of voter turnout, but also in terms of partisanship, of thinking of themselves in partisan terms in the United States. And we see, I should say, that immigration issues also very clearly affect large numbers of the Asian American population as well. By many accounts, the framing of these issues, both by politicians and the media, tend to be very Latino focused. So we see when immigration comes to the forefront of political debate in 2006 and at other points, we see it resonating much more with the Latino community than we do with the Asian American population.
Hi, thank you. So I guess my question is, if we do see, if like the sleeping giant awakes for this election, and there is a larger turnout of Latino voters for this election, do you think that's a trend that will continue, where there will be a continuous larger percentage of them that participate? Or do you think when the election is slightly less focused on immigration, it would go back down again?
So that's a really excellent question, and I think that to a large extent, the answer depends not only on who the winner is of the election, but also if the winner is Clinton, whether or not she does anything on immigration reform. So what we have seen in off-year elections, we've seen a lot of frustration with President Obama, who really committed to enacting comprehensive immigration reform in his first year in office, and he failed to do so, and we've seen a lot of critiques of Obama by the Latino press and by the Latino electorate for not doing so. Clinton has made a similar promise that she'll enact comprehensive immigration reform very quickly. And I think the real question that we see within the Latino population isn't so much, especially these days, whether or not a majority of Latinos will vote for Republicans, but will they eventually become disengaged with the political system? So if we see Clinton elected and not acting, and we see, especially if there's a Democratic majority in the Senate or something like that, I could imagine that we might see a spike, and then it's possible we would see eventual frustration or disengagement.
Some college and Mr. Boswell, thank you for your time on this one. So I'll just get that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you all very much. Thank you for coming.